They kept secrets in rooms and then made them permanent on paper. What the owners did in secret to their favorite female slaves would shock even today, not because the ledger offers lurid detail, but because it shows how private coercion was converted into routine, recorded, and reproduced by administration. Content warning. This account refers to coercive control and exploitation documented in archival records. The description is non-graphic and focuses on administrative mechanisms and material traces. On a sun-warmed table, the ledger lay open, its pages soft with age, ink browned where hands had pressed too long, margins smudged by fingers that had turned the paper for years. A single line, brief and bureaucratic, looks at first like any other. A notation in a scribe's careful hand. A date, a terse phrase. Corrective assignment, Amina. That line, and the small cluster of related entries that follow it, are the visible end of a larger choreography. Taken together with ration rolls, overseer logs, and a few unexpected artifacts rescued during conservation, they reveal how household managers translated a private disfavor into a formal policy, the reassignment of bodies, resources, and rights. Amina appears in the record as little more than a name and a string of ledger references. Sometimes the entries include age estimates or roles like spinner or house attendant. Her life, as far as the archive allows, is composed of fragments: a note folded into a hem, a trace of handwriting on a margin, a tally of rations reduced by a token sum. And yet those fragments are enough to reconstruct the mechanism that turned household preference and punishment into administrative practice. To tell the process is not to theatrically expose private acts. It is to show how seemingly neutral paperwork carried the force of law inside a household and across generations. After a few of those ledger lines were brought to light by Conservator Amelia, investigators Lewis and Professor Andrews began to follow the paper trail. Their work assembled the roles that made the household run. A steward who recorded and rationalized decisions, an overseer who translated orders into movement and labor, a minister or moral authority who framed disciplinary actions in ritual language, a scribe whose hand committed those decisions to the book. Each name alone sounds like furniture of governance, but together they formed a bureaucracy with daily reach into the most intimate parts of life. The ledger was not a passive witness, it was an instrument of power. To understand how that paperwork operated, it helps to look closely at words the ledger used again and again. Corrective assignment appears in several houses' ledgers across seasons, sometimes attached to different names, but always accompanied by the same operational marks. An alteration in sleeping allotments, a change in ration tallies, a cross-reference to assigned cohabitation, and an accompanying, often small, token payment entry. The phrase assigned cohabitation in the entries is not explicit about intimacy, but in context it indicates a formal reallocation of space and supervision: who slept where, who was expected to share certain quarters, and who came under a particular overseer's watch. These are administrative acts with immediate material consequences. The steward's signature, when present, gives the action administrative validity. The overseer's notation, shorthand for moved or a carré marking a transfer, made the change operational. The minister's brief endorsement on occasion supplied the moral language that made enforcement socially intelligible within the household. A small endorsement in the hand of a religious attendant that reframed a punitive measure as corrective instruction. The scribe, whose task was to make such arrangements durable, stamped them into the ledger's columns. Paperwork created permanence where there had been a momentary humiliation or a private order. Once recorded, an incident became a precedent and a template for future action. What follows from those entries is concrete and far-reaching. The ledger shows that after a corrective assignment entry, rations allocated to the person named were reduced by a fixed amount in subsequent weeks. Places in the interior rooms were reallocated to others. The person moved to a dormitory corner or outer barrack where oversight was tighter and privacy was reduced. Letters that might have been exchanged were redirected to the steward's inspection or marked as examined. When a child was involved, as several cross-indexed birth registers and baptismal notes suggest in Amina's case, the ledger recorded a reclassification. The child's name appeared in a column labeled Other Issue rather than House Stock, or their allocation was tied to a household ledger number rather than to the female listed as mother in domestic accounts. These administrative shifts reshaped everyday life and, over time, remade family and social recognition. The ledger's authority did something else that is less immediately visible. It rewrote kinship. Where a child's belonging had once been recognized in practice, who fed the child, who taught them, who named them, the ledger's columns could strip those fabric relationships of official acknowledgement. In inheritance calculations, in local knowledge of who belonged to whom, and in the categories used by clerks or parish officials when later compiling records, those ledger notations made a difference. The record did not only punish in the short term, it produced durable categories. Across generations, that administrative reclassification could mean the loss of rights, the erasure of acknowledged parentage, and a changed social identity. Yet the margins of these books also contain counter-narratives. Conservator Amelia's careful unbinding project revealed a hidden cuff stitched into the back pages with thread that matches no known household linen pattern. It was folded inward so that only a portion of its embroidered name peeked from between the leaves. The fabric bore a set of small repairs in a hand different from any record holder's, invisible mending that suggested a care at odds with the ledger's cold tally. The presence of the cuff between pages where corrective assignment entries cluster is not explicit proof of resistance, but its concealment within the very structure of the ledger suggests a deliberate act of preservation. Someone placed a fragment of ordinary life inside the pages that otherwise recorded displacement and reduction. Similarly, when the hem of a worker's apron conserved separately was examined under magnification, tiny folded notes emerged stitched into the seam, slivers of paper whose ink had faded to near invisibility. The script is abbreviated, names are hinted at rather than spelled. One fragment reads, in part, an exhortation that appears to be a reading lesson, letters to learn, followed by a sequence of letters and a smudged number. The apron's owner likely hid these slivers knowing that the seam would be overlooked. These traces point to acts of agency that coexist with the ledger's authority: clandestine teaching, furtive record-keeping, the private naming of relationships where the ledger refused to name. Those material evidences matter because they complicate a tidy reading of the archive. It would be easy and simplistic to say the ledger simply records harm and oppression. It does. But it also records the means by which the people bound to these institutions tried to sustain connection and identity. The cuff is not a manifesto, nor are the folded notes a legal claim. Rather, they are small insistences on personhood. They show that within a system designed to categorize and control, people found ways to make and preserve attachments that the ledger tried to neutralize. The reconstruction of Amina's case, and of similar entries, depends on careful triangulation. Investigator Lewis began not with a sensational interpretation, but with cross-referencing, matching the ledger entries to ration rolls kept in the same archive, to overseer walk lists, to baptismal entries held at the parish chest, and to correspondence in the steward's files. Professor Andrews contributed a comparative lens, pointing out that corrective assignment language appears in multiple estates ledgers across a region and across decades, often attached to a small routine downward adjustment in ration allotments and a physical reassignment within sleeping quarters. Conservative patterns emerged. When the phrase appears, there is usually an associated change in resource allocation and living assignments within 1 to 3 weeks. That pattern does not detail what happened behind closed doors. It does, however, show how administrative language produced recurring, predictable effects. Those patterns are visible in technical traces as much as in content. Amelia's conservation work revealed trimmed pages and scraped margins where earlier hands had evidently removed names or marginalia. In some cases, chemical analysis indicated that a blot had been deliberately erased, the paper abraded and then re-inked to mask a prior entry. In others, folios had been cut and rebound in a different order, scattering related notations. These physical alterations create cautionary notes for interpretation. Absences in the archive can be as meaningful as presences. When a page has been trimmed, we cannot know with certainty what vocabulary was lost. When a name is scraped away, we must resist reconstructing the missing content without corroboration. Because of these gaps, the narrative must hold two tensions at once: conviction about what the available evidence shows, and humility about what it cannot confirm. The ledger's entries demonstrate an administrative process that moved bodies and resources, and that reproduced social hierarchies in paper form. The cuff and the hidden notes indicate strategies of resilience, but beyond what the documents and conserved objects can bear, there are limits. We cannot, from the ledger alone, know the intimate details of relationships or the private conversations that preceded a scribe's line. We can only trace the bureaucratic consequences that followed. This is the central argument that follows from the records. The real horror, in many ways, is not in imagined private scenes, but in the efficiency and everydayness with which power was routinized. A terse entry, Amina, corrective assignment, is modular. It can be repeated, copied, and normalized. It becomes a template a steward can apply when discipline is desired, an overseer can execute without moral deliberation, and a future clerk can treat as settled fact. Paperwork turned an episodic choice by an owner into a household procedure. Normalization through paperwork is a form of violence because it removes contingencies and makes arbitrary control seem routine and legitimate. The ledger also teaches something about how public institutions have a continuing responsibility for these records. Archives are not neutral repositories of dead facts. They are active sites where the past is made legible and where moral judgments are formed. Conservator Amelia's discovery of the cuff only came when the ledger was subjected to technical care, dry cleaning, fiber analysis, and cautious, discreet unbinding. Were it not for that conservation intervention, the cuff might have remained invisible, a margin note that never reached public view. The work of preservation is not merely about keeping paper from decay. It is an ethical act that rescues human traces from being forgotten or destroyed. At the same time, historians and conservators must practice restraint. Where pages have been trimmed, we must not fill voids with speculation. Where marginalia is ambiguous, we must present competing interpretations and explain why one reading is more probable. Lewis and Professor Andrews published careful notes alongside their findings. An appendix of the ledger's folio numbers, transcriptions of the key lines, and a catalog of the conservatorial techniques used to reveal concealed materials. Their methodology is a model of how to approach sensitive evidence responsibly. Make your sources transparent, admit uncertainties, and resist the temptation to translate documentary silence into narrative certainty. There is also an ethical dimension to public communication about these records. The title that brought us here is blunt. It names what the owners did in secret to their favorite female slaves. That bluntness can serve a purpose, to draw attention to a past often minimized. But it can also mislead if it encourages lurid imaginings detached from the evidence. The ledger's entries make clear the mechanisms by which favoritism and punishment were institutionalized. They do not, and cannot, supply the graphic details that would satisfy voyeuristic curiosity. Our duty as historians is to uncover how institutions operated, and to tell, with care, what those operations meant for people's lives. In practical terms, what the records demand from us now is twofold. First, they call for continued investment in archival preservation. Ledgers are fragile. Stitched cuffs can be obscured behind a binding. Marginalia can fade beyond legibility. Supporting conservation means supporting the possibility that more hidden traces can be recovered. Second, they demand that archives be made accessible in ways that respect descendants and communities affected by the records. That means providing context, allowing for community consultation about sensitive materials, and supporting digitization projects that enable careful, ethical research without exposing vulnerable materials to damage. There are also civic responsibilities that the ledger suggests. Administrative acts that were once private had public consequences. Their echoes persist. The categories created in these household books have, in some cases, become the basis for later civic classification and social treatment. Understanding that history equips us to question inherited categories today. It asks contemporary institutions, courts, registries, local governments, and historical societies to consider how the bureaucracies we accept today can normalize harm or obscure human relationships. The lesson is not to equate past and present uncritically, but to recognize the same danger in the mundane, the way a checkbox or a form can make a human relational fact invisible. Amina's name, when read aloud in a seminar room, elicits only silence at first. But it should not be the silence of resignation. The ledger that once made her a line in a column is now part of a larger public record. It testifies both to the cruelty of bureaucratic normalization and to the small but persistent resistances that followed. The cuff tucked between pages, the notes stitched into seams, the clandestine reading lessons preserved in an apron. Those acts of survival do not cancel the harm, they complicate it. They remind us that agency can be exercised in many forms, even when formal power seems total. The narrative ends not with a dramatic revelation. The ledger does not provide one, but with a sober request. These pages and the artifacts associated with them belong to a public memory that has been neglected for too long. If you found this reconstruction compelling, consider how you might support the institutions that make such work possible. Local archives, conservators, and scholarly projects that practice ethical, evidence-based history. Share this story with care, and, if you can, contribute to preservation efforts or volunteer to support local historical collections. Leave in the comments a respectful reflection on what the ledger's evidence demands of us today. Attention, preservation, and the commitment to remember with dignity. When the ledger is closed and the cuff is returned to its protective mount, the thin line of thread that spells a name still faces the light. The books that recorded punitive routines also hold, in their margins and bindings, the traces of persons who insisted on being seen. To read these sources well is to acknowledge the ledger's power and the margin's resistance, to tell the truth of administrative cruelty without sensationalizing private suffering, and to act so that more of these stories can be preserved and made known with the integrity they deserve.